Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. It was one of those weekends when the world felt too loud, and the only way to escape it was to leave everything behind. My friends Mike, Sarah, and Jason and I decided to explore a remote canyon in Utah. We'd read about it in a travel blog. The pictures looked stunning. Sheer cliffs that seemed to stretch forever, a river cutting through the valley, and an eerie, almost otherworldly silence. It sounded perfect for a little adventure and some peace. We set off early that Saturday morning, packed with supplies and enough enthusiasm to forget how isolated this place really was. As we hiked deeper into the canyon, the scenery shifted. The vibrant colors of the rocks seemed to drain away, replaced by muted grays and browns. Even the air felt different, thicker somehow, like the canyon was holding its breath. About an hour into the hike, I spotted a deer on a ridge above us. At first, I thought nothing of it. Wildlife was part of the appeal, after all, but then I noticed its movements. They weren't right. The deer moved in short, jerky motions, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. In its head, it kept twisting to look at us, too fast, too deliberate. "Hey, check that out," I said, pointing it out to the group. Mike squinted. "Weird. Maybe it's injured." Sarah frowned. "No, that's not how an injured animal moves. It looks wrong." We stood there, watching it for a long moment. The deer didn't move closer or run away. It just stood there, staring. Eventually, Jason shrugged it off. "It's just a deer, guys. Let's keep moving." But even as we continued down the trail, I couldn't shake the image of its hollow, black eyes. By the time we reached a spot to set up camp, the sun was starting to dip behind the canyon walls, casting long, creeping shadows over the ground. We pitched our tents near the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley. The view was breathtaking, but the silence felt heavier now, oppressive even. There wasn't the usual nighttime symphony of crickets or rustling leaves, just an endless, suffocating stillness. After dinner, we sat around the campfire, trying to lighten the mood with ghost stories and jokes. But something about the place made it hard to relax. Every so often, I'd catch Sarah glancing over her shoulder or Jason fiddling nervously with his flashlight. Even Mike, who was usually the laid-back one, seemed on edge. Around midnight, we called it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and tried to sleep. But the silence outside was deafening, and every little sound, every creak of the trees, every faint rustle of the wind felt magnified. And then I heard footsteps. They were soft at first, crunching faintly on the gravel outside. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, moving closer to my tent. "Mike," I whispered, unzipping the flap just enough to peek out. What I saw standing there wasn't Mike. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly, like two smoldering embers in the dark. But what froze me in place was what it was wearing. Mike's jacket. It wasn't Mike. It couldn't be. But then it spoke, and the voice that came out was his. "Come outside," it said, tilting its head unnaturally to one side. It's beautiful. The voice was perfect, an exact match for Mike's. But there was something hollow about it, something lifeless. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Behind me, I heard the real Mike's voice, groggy and confused. "Who are you talking to?" The creature's head snapped toward Mike's, tense so fast it was a blur, its body twisting in a way that no human body should. For a moment, it just stood there frozen like it was deciding what to do. Then, in one horrifying, fluid motion, it bolted into the darkness, its limbs moving like a spider's as it disappeared into the canyon. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and whispered arguments. None of us dared to go outside or even unzip our tents. When dawn finally broke, we packed up in silence and left the canyon as quickly as we could. We never talked about what happened, not in detail anyway, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear Mike's voice in my head saying those words again. Come outside. It's beautiful, and I wonder if the canyon is still out there, waiting for its next visitors. Or if the thing we saw that night is still wearing Mike's jacket, calling someone else's name. Story 2. Driving alone through the Navajo reservation at 2 a.m. was the kind of bad idea you don't realize is bad until you're halfway through it. The darkness swallowed everything. No streetlights, no houses, just an endless stretch of asphalt bordered by whispering desert winds. My headlights carved weak paths through the black, but beyond there was nothingness. I was on my way to a friend's wedding, thinking I'd shave a couple of hours off the drive with this shortcut. GPS had promised a quick and scenic route. It delivered on one promise, but not the other. About 30 minutes in, I saw it, a coyote standing dead center in the road. Its body was unnervingly still, its head low, eyes reflecting the pale glow of my headlights like dull coins. Something about it didn't sit right. I slowed the car, thinking it would scurry off. It didn't. I honked, a sharp blast of sound cutting through the silence. That's when it turned its head toward me, and my stomach dropped. Its face wasn't an animal's face. Not entirely. The longer I stared, the more it looked human. The snout was too short, the eyes too calculating, and the mouth, oh God, the mouth, twisted into something like a grin. I slammed the brakes, my tires squealing against the empty road. As the car skidded to a stop, the thing rose onto its hind legs. They cracked and stretched as they straightened, and the shape that stood there was no longer coyote-sized. It towered, grotesquely thin, its limbs unnaturally long, fingers curling like hooks. Every nerve in my body screamed to move, but I was frozen, staring at the thing as it started walking toward my car. Not running, walking, slowly, deliberately, as though it knew I had nowhere to go. My hand fumbled for the lock button, and the sound of the doors clicking shut felt pitifully weak against the suffocating dread closing in around me. I threw the car into reverse, the gears grinding in protest, and started rolling backward. That's when it dropped the pretense of humanity. It sprinted. Its limbs flailed wildly, but it was fast, too fast, closing the distance before I could even process what was happening. I floored the gas, the engine roaring as I reversed down the road, the headlights casting erratic shadows of the thing chasing me. It didn't falter. its body jerking unnaturally as it kept pace. The creature's face stretched into something monstrous, its grin widening impossibly, teeth glinting in the light. My breath came in shallow gasps, my hands shaking on the wheel as I struggled to keep the car steady. Then, without warning, it veered off the road and vanished into the desert. One moment it was there, relentless and horrifying, and the next it was gone. The sudden emptiness was almost worse. I didn't dare stop. I didn't even slow down. I just kept driving, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. By the time I reached my friend's house, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me shaky and nauseous. She opened the door, all smiles, until she saw my face. I must have looked like I'd crawled out of my own grave. "What happened?" she asked, ushering me inside. I told her every detail. The coyote in the road, its human-like face, the way it chased me. By the time I finished, she was pale, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored my own. "You saw a skinwalker," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're lucky it didn't catch you." I wanted to laugh it off, to tell her she was being ridiculous, but the words stuck in my throat. Deep down, I knew she was right. That night, we burned sage. She prayed, and though I didn't know the words, I prayed too. I didn't sleep, jumping at every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows. I haven't driven through that area since. I won't even look at it on a map. Some places aren't meant for shortcuts. Some roads aren't meant to be taken. And some things, some terrible and human things, are better left undisturbed. Story 3. Growing up, the woods behind my grandmother's house were as much a part of my life as the air I breathed. The trees stood tall, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, blocking out the sunlight during the day and swallowing the moonlight at night. It wasn't uncommon for kids in the area to claim the woods were haunted. Shadows played tricks, and the wind carried whispers that tickled the edge of your hearing. But to me, it was just home until that night. My grandmother was a stern woman, weathered by years of living near the reservation. She had this way of speaking, like every word she said was dipped in truth and wrapped in warning. She'd say things like, "Don't whistle at night," or "If you hear your name called from the woods, ignore it." I'd roll my eyes every time. Superstitions, I thought. Old stories meant to keep kids in line. I didn't believe her until the night I nearly walked into something I couldn't explain. It was the summer I turned 13. My cousins and I had set up camp just past the tree line, close enough to see the house, but far enough to feel like we were on our own little adventure. The fire crackled, the stars shimmered, and the three of us sat on logs, toasting marshmallows and telling stories. The night was calm, the kind of stillness that presses down on you like a weighted blanket. Then I heard it. "Jason." It was faint, barely audible over the pop of the fire, but clear enough to make me pause mid-sentence. I looked at my cousins. Neither of them seemed to notice. "Jason." It came again, louder this time, from the direction of the woods. My chest tightened. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It was my mom's voice. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit. "Hear what?" my cousin Mark said, biting into his charred marshmallow. "Someone's calling me." I said, standing up. My legs felt shaky, like they'd forgotten how to work. Mark's twin, Lily, frowned. It's probably the wind. Sit down, you're freaking me out. But it wasn't the wind. I knew my mom's voice. She had this way of drawing out the last syllable of my name, like she was coaxing me. Jason. That's exactly how it sounded, soft and sweet, but somehow wrong. I'm just going to check, I said, already walking toward the woods. Mark grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. His face was pale, his freckles standing out starkly against his skin. Don't go, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's not your mom. I froze. Of course it is, I said, trying to sound confident. But my heart was pounding now, each beat loud and insistent in my ears. It's not, Mark insisted. Grandma told us about this. If you hear your name from the woods, don't answer. It's a skinwalker. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and terrifying. Skinwalker. I didn't believe in that stuff, did I? But something about the way he said it, the way his eyes darted to the shadows like he was expecting something to leap out, made me hesitate. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, barely distinguishable from the darkness of the trees. But as my eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. It was tall and thin, unnaturally so, with long limbs that didn't quite bend right. Its face, or what was supposed to be its face, was smooth, featureless, like someone had draped a sheet of skin over a mannequin's head. It stepped closer, and my stomach turned. Its movements were stiff, jerky, like it was a puppet being controlled by someone who didn't quite know how to work the strings. Jason, it whispered, but the voice had changed. It was deeper now, raspier, like sandpaper against stone. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. Mark yanked me away, and the three of us bolted for the house, leaving the fire and our camping gear behind. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see, or worse, what might see me. When we burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us, my grandmother was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. She didn't look surprised to see us, not even a little. You heard it, didn't you? She asked, her voice calm, but laced with something that felt like sadness. I nodded, too out of breath to speak. She stood up and began locking the doors and windows, muttering prayers under her breath. It knows your name now, she said. That makes it stronger. Next time, don't listen. It won't just call your name. It'll take your soul. Her words sent a chill down my spine. We stayed up all night, huddled together in the living room while my grandmother burned sage and whispered in Navajo. I never went back to the woods after that. Even now, years later, I can still hear that voice in my nightmares, calling me, tempting me to step into the darkness. Jason. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd answered.